Ladies and gentlemen, sorry, what's happening? Ladies and gentlemen, we have come a very long way since we had to blow a whistle and go over the top of the trenches directly into machine gun fire. We've come a very long way since we had to destroy entire nations in order to win the war. The fact of the matter is that in today's society, we can achieve our military aims without risking thousands of our own lives and without destroying the countries we're going into. The way to do that is by embracing technology and by embracing drone warfare. That's why Team Proposition is proud to come to you under the team line that a blood-free army means a bloodless battle. I'm going to be speaking about one point, how we lead to more effective wars being fought. My second speaker is going to be talking about the principles of war, and she's going to be showing you why even if drone warfare is slightly more harmful, we still think that it's a legitimate mechanism. So before I move into my substantive case, 4 points of context. Firstly, what do we mean by a drone? So we're not talking about autonomous robotics. We're talking specifically but not exclusively about UAVs. We're talking about things which are remotely operated by human beings. Secondly, what is this debate about? Today's debate is not about the legitimacy of the interventions we're talking about. It's about the specific mechanism which is used in those interventions. Thirdly, what wars are we talking about? We're talking about both current and future potential wars. And what we see is that there's a global trend away from one army versus one army. We're seeing a trend towards fighting enemies which are distributed, fighting enemies which are secretive, enemies such as Al-Qaeda. So what we see is that this necessitates two distinct approaches which we haven't needed before. Firstly, there's more of an emphasis on fighting wars with the use of intelligence. We need as much information as possible to win these wars of secrecy. Secondly, it's necessitating targeted assassinations. Because there are no longer formal armies we're fighting against, we need to take the snake out by the head. Fourth, what harm does opposition need to prove? Opposition doesn't only need to show that these drones are harmful, they need to show that that harm is intrinsic to drones. They need to show that harm can't be regulated out and can't be mitigated through the development of these technologies. So let's move on to my substantive case with my point of efficacy. Here I'll be proving that we get more effective wars being fought. Two conclusions will be reached from that. Firstly, we'll see that it is a good and effective mechanism. Secondly, because of the fact that it allows us to achieve our aims with minimal costs, we see that it also means that it's a legitimate mechanism. So before I move into this, what are the alternatives we're talking about? Two alternatives. One, boots on the ground intervention, or two, the use of fighter jets. However, with fighter jets, we will still need boots on the ground intervention. Why? They have far shorter range than drones, would need to be setting up those air bases in those nations. So essentially, both of those need boots on the ground intervention. So what are our aims with warfare? Two aims. One, we need to achieve our aims as a country with that intervention. Two, we want to mitigate harms to that local country while we're doing that. So firstly, let's look at achieving short-term goals and how we do that. So why are drones effective in this regard? Three reasons. One, they can access remote locations more than the alternatives. For two reasons. One, we see that they're just far more versatile. It's easier to get them to those remote locations. Secondly, they're stealthier, so they can get to those locations easier without being detected. Secondly, they're more precise. They can get closer to these targets because of their stealth, and they can deliver precise ordnance. The fact is that these drones can't carry massive payloads, and what that means is that they need to be as precise as possible, so they hit the targets cleanly. Thirdly, they're useful for intelligence gathering, as I told you is very important. So they're very useful for that kind of surveillance. So on the converse side, why are the alternatives ineffective at achieving these aims? Well, what we see is that it's the blunt, brute force approach. It's less targeted. And in modern warfare, it's not about one army against one army. It's about subtleties. It's about hitting specific and precise targets. Secondly, we see that it requires large-scale interventions. You can't simply go in, take out the strike, get out cleanly. You have to mount a full-scale invasion. That's just not practical in many cases. And before I move on to my second leg of how we minimize harm, points.
So considering drones are so accurate, how do you explain the thousands of civilian casualties in recent years?
Well, of course we concede that it's never going to be completely accurate. We're never going to be able to just take out one individual, but we think that it's far more effective than the alternative. More than that, going back to what I told you at the beginning of my speech, we don't have to prove that there's no harm in drones. We have to prove that any harms aren't intrinsic to drones. So sure, in the 1800s, muskets weren't very accurate. That can develop over time. So how do we minimize harm to that country, both in the short term and the long term? So let's start with the short term. We minimize harm in 4 ways. Firstly, let's look at the nature of engagement. So what we see is that with drone strikes, there's never any direct engagement between your force and your opposition. With boots on the ground intervention, you do get that messy engagement. That means 2 things. Firstly, with that direct engagement, people die. Not just the people in the different armies, but people get caught in the crossfire. That's when you get far more civilian deaths. Secondly, that's when you get massive infrastructural tolls to the country which you're going into. We want to minimize that as much as possible. We want to get in, achieve our objectives, and then get out cleanly. Secondly, let's look at self-inflicted harm. So what we see is that when you go in with an army into that country, they then have the incentive to, for example, plant IEDs, to, for example, take down their own bridges and take down their own power supplies. That is removed when you aren't actually going in on the ground. Thirdly, let's look at human error and how that's minimized with drones. So with drones, we mitigate this in 2 ways. Firstly, what we see is that drone pilots are removed from the situation. They don't have that direct fear, they don't have that direct adrenaline, which leads to irrational actions. Secondly, there's increased accountability with drone pilots for 2 reasons. One, what we see is that they act as a member of a team. There are 10 people piloting this device, rather than, for example, 1 person piloting a fighter jet. And more than that, there's footage of everything that they do. So there's more accountability that mitigates against that human risk, that human error. On the other hand, if we look at troops, there's massive amounts of that human error. For example, in the last year alone, 3 US soldiers have gone on civilian massacres and rampages. We want to mitigate that. Fourth, as I've told you before, drones are more precise. They may not get no civilian casualties, but they limit that. Lastly, let's look at how we achieve long-term stability for the country we're going into. So what we see is that, firstly, you're never really there. You don't have that direct engagement. You don't leave that country wrecked because you get in and act cleanly without detrimenting that country more than is necessary. Secondly, it's easier to withdraw. It's quick and simple to take your drones out. It's far harder to take an entire army out. More than that, you don't develop dependency in that country. When you send your entire army into a country, that army tends to take over functions like security, functions like the military, which leaves that country unable or less able to function when you withdraw. And lastly, let's look at the mentality of the people. When you go in with your army, you make that country hate you. We want to be as minimally as invasive as possible to maintain that local support and buy-in. Ladies and gentlemen, war no longer has to mean massive death tolls. We must embrace technology so that we can achieve our aims without disadvantaging other countries.